Chapter 1. The Peculiar Visitor. The autumn of 1887 brought with it a peculiar gloom to London, the kind that seeps into one's bones and settles there like an unwelcome tenant. The rain had been relentless for 3 days, drumming against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings with a persistence that matched my friend's mood. Sherlock Holmes had been without a case of interest for nearly a fortnight, and his brilliant mind, like a finely tuned engine with no purpose, had begun to consume itself. Had just returned from visiting a patient with a curious case of tropical fever when I found Holmes slouched in his armchair, surrounded by a nebulous cloud of pipe smoke. The room was in disarray, with newspapers scattered across the floor, each open to reports of crimes Holmes had undoubtedly solved before finishing his morning tea. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. "I see your patient with the Malayan fever is improving, though you're concerned about a secondary infection." I hung my sodden coat by the fire and shook my head in familiar amazement. "Will you ever cease to astound me, Holmes? Yes, the fever has indeed broken, but how could you possibly know about my concern for a secondary infection?" A thin smile crossed his face as he finally turned to regard me. "Your left coat sleeve bears traces of the particular ointment used for such tropical ailments, a specialty of yours from your military days. However, you've also brought with you the distinct odour of carbolic acid, which suggests you're taking extraordinary precautions against contagion. Ergo, you're concerned about complications. When you explain it, it sounds utterly elementary," I admitted, settling into my chair opposite him. "Everything is elementary, Watson, when one simply observes rather than merely sees." He sighed deeply, tossing aside a newspaper. "But what good are these faculties when London's criminal class has apparently decided to take a holiday? Not a single case worthy of intellectual engagement." As if summoned by his lament, a sharp knock came at our door. Mrs. Hudson, our landlady, entered with an expression of mild disapproval at the state of our rooms. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "A most peculiar gentleman, I must say. He insists it's a matter of grave urgency." Holmes straightened immediately, his eyes kindling with interest. "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson." The transformation in my friend was remarkable. Like a bloodhound catching a scent, he was suddenly alert. The lassitude of moments ago vanished entirely. He hastily cleared some space, kicked several newspapers under his chair, and positioned himself with affected nonchalance by the fireplace. Our visitor entered moments later, and even I, accustomed as I was to the strange characters who sought Holmes's counsel, was struck by his appearance. He was tall and gaunt, with the pallor of one who rarely sees daylight. His clothes, though of excellent quality, hung awkwardly on his frame, suggesting a recent and significant loss of weight. Most striking were his eyes, dark, deeply recessed, and darting nervously around the room, as if expecting danger from any quarter. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired in a voice barely above a whisper. "Indeed," my friend replied. "And this is my colleague and chronicler, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely before him." The man hesitated, clutching his hat so tightly that his knuckles whitened. "My name is Edward Harrington. I am, or rather was, the curator of rare manuscripts at the Thornfield Library. I fear I may be going mad, Mr. Holmes, or worse. That what I am experiencing is terribly horrifyingly real. Holmes gestured to a chair. "Pray, take a seat, Mr. Harrington. You're shivering, though not, I think, entirely from the cold." "Ah, perceptive, sir," Harrington said, sinking into the offered chair. "I have not slept properly in 3 nights. I dare not. Begin at the beginning," Holmes instructed, folding his long fingers beneath his chin in his characteristic pose of concentration. "Omit nothing, however trivial it may seem to you." Harrington took a deep breath. "It concerns a manuscript that came into the library's possession 1 month ago. A bequest from the estate of Lord Montgomery Blackwood, who died under unusual circumstances." "Unusual how?" I interjected. "He was found in his locked study, apparently having died of fright. The doctors could find no other cause. His heart simply stopped." Harrington paused. The manuscript was clutched in his hands. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Interesting. Continue." "The manuscript itself is ancient, purportedly dating back to the 15th century. It contains what appears to be a series of puzzles or ciphers, interspersed with disturbing illustrations. Lord Blackwood had been attempting to translate it before his death." Harrington's voice dropped further. "3 nights ago, I began to hear it." "Hear it?" Holmes asked sharply. "A scream, Mr. Holmes. A terrible, inhuman scream that seems to emanate from the pages themselves, but only when it rains." Harrington looked desperately between us. "Last night I discovered writing on my bedroom wall, writing in a hand that matches the manuscript, though I keep it securely locked in the library vault." Holmes leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "And what did this writing say?" "The cipher walks among you. Find it before the 3rd scream." Harrington's voice broke. "Mr. Holmes, there have been 2 screams already. If I am not going mad, then I fear whatever malevolence is contained within those pages is about to manifest fully." "You have brought the manuscript with you?" Holmes asked. Harrington shook his head vehemently. "I dared not remove it from the vault. Not after—" "After what, Mr. Harrington?" I prompted when he fell silent. "After the 2nd librarian was found, dead this morning. Like Lord Blackwood, he appeared to have died of fright. But his face, Mr. Holmes—" Harrington covered his own face with trembling hands. His face was contorted into such an expression of horror that the police photographer refused to document it. Holmes sprang from his chair with sudden energy. "Watson, it seems we have a case at last. Mr. Harrington, we shall accompany you back to the Thornfield Library immediately. The rain shows no sign of abating, and if your supernatural timepiece is to be believed, we have precious little time before the 3rd scream." As we prepared to depart, I caught Holmes's eye. There was no trace of skepticism there, only the keen anticipation of a complex puzzle. Whatever awaited us at the Thornfield Library, I knew that my friend's rational mind would uncover the truth behind this apparent spectre of sound and fear. What I could not know then was how fundamentally this case would challenge Holmes's devotion to logic, nor how close we would both come to joining the ranks of those who had died with terror etched upon their faces. Chapter 2. The Thornfield Library. The hansom cab splashed through puddles that had accumulated into small lakes at every corner, the driver seemingly as eager as his horses to be done with the journey. Holmes sat in contemplative silence beside me, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the flashes of gaslight we passed. Harrington, seated opposite us, appeared to grow more agitated with each passing minute. "Mr. Harrington," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "who else has had access to this manuscript since its arrival at your library?" "Very few, Mr. Holmes. Myself, naturally, as curator, Dr. James Fairfield, the head librarian who died this morning, the library's security guard, Harold Minton, and of course Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, Lord Montgomery's widow, who delivered it personally." Harrington twisted his handkerchief nervously. "Oh, and Professor Hamilton from Oxford examined it briefly last week. And the manuscript itself, you said it contains puzzles or ciphers." Holmes continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, though none of us could make sense of them. Lord Blackwood had apparently begun the process of deciphering the text, but his notes were as cryptic as the manuscript itself. Were there any visitors to the library who showed particular interest in the acquisition?" Harrington frowned. "Now that you mention it, there was a gentleman, foreign I believe, who inquired about our recent acquisitions. He seemed disappointed when I explained that the Blackwood manuscript was not available for public viewing." The cab lurched to a halt before a grand Victorian edifice, its stone facade blackened by decades of London smoke. Despite the late hour, several windows glowed with lamplight, and I noticed a police constable standing sentry at the entrance. "Inspector Lestrade is already here," Holmes observed with a slight curve of his lips. "How fortuitous," the constable recognized Holmes immediately and allowed us passage with a respectful nod. The interior of the Thornfield Library struck me as both magnificent and oppressive. Towering shelves of leather-bound volumes, marble floors that amplified every footstep, and heavy wooden furniture that seemed to absorb what little light the gas lamps provided. Inspector Lestrade met us in the main hall, his ferret-like features arranged in an expression of bemused irritation. "I might have known you'd appear, Mr. Holmes, though I confess I'm at a loss as to how you've already involved yourself in this business. Mr. Harrington sought our counsel before contacting Scotland Yard," Holmes replied smoothly. "A wise decision, given the unusual nature of the circumstances." Lestrade snorted. "Unusual is one way of putting it. I've got a dead man with no marks upon him save the look of absolute terror on his face, and a room full of librarians babbling about screaming books and walking ciphers. I assure you, Inspector, I am not in the habit of babbling," Harrington said stiffly. "Take us to where the body was discovered," Holmes interjected before Lestrade could respond. The inspector led us through a labyrinth of bookshelves to a small office tucked away in a corner of the building. The room had been cordoned off, though the body had already been removed. Holmes immediately set to work, examining every inch of the space with his pocket magnifying glass, paying particular attention to the desk and the floor beneath it. "The victim was found here?" Holmes asked, indicating the space before the desk. "Yes," Lestrade confirmed, slumped forward, as if he had risen from his chair and collapsed. Holmes knelt, running his fingers over an almost imperceptible stain on the wooden floorboards, and the time of death. "The police surgeon estimates between midnight and 2 this morning. During the heaviest of the rainfall," I noted. "Indeed, Watson." Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light that told me his mind was racing far ahead of ours. Now, Mr. Harrington, I should like to see this notorious manuscript. Harrington paled. Now? But it's nearly midnight. The third scream is precisely what we must understand. Holmes finished for him. Lead on, if you please. The manuscript vault lay in the library's basement, a chamber more akin to a bank than a repository of knowledge. Heavy iron doors with multiple locks barred the way, and Harrington's hands trembled visibly as he worked through the sequence of keys. We keep our most valuable items here, he explained unnecessarily, as the final lock yielded. Climate-controlled, fireproof, and sealed against pests and dampness. The chamber beyond was clinically sterile compared to the ornate library above. Metal shelving units held document boxes and specially designed cases. Harrington led us to a table at the centre, where a single item lay, a book-sized leather case with brass fittings. This contains the Blackwood manuscript, he said, making no move to open it. Holmes stepped forward without hesitation and released the clasps. The case opened to reveal what appeared to be a collection of ancient parchment. Pages bound together by a cord through punched holes. The topmost page bore intricate, faded symbols surrounding an illustration that, even to my inexperienced eye, appeared disturbing in its anatomical impossibility. Part mathematical diagram, part human form, contorted into a configuration that made one's eyes ache to follow. Fascinating, Holmes murmured, carefully turning the first page to reveal more of the same incomprehensible symbols, interspersed with drawings that seemed to shift subtly even as I looked at them. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the small high windows of the basement vault. Harrington flinched at each crescendo, his eyes darting between the manuscript and the ceiling. Mr. Holmes, Lestrade began skeptically. Surely you don't believe... He was interrupted by a sound that defied description. Not quite human, not quite animal, but undeniably a scream that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The manuscript pages fluttered as if caught in a breeze, though the air in the vault was perfectly still. I shall never forget the expression on Sherlock Holmes's face in that moment. Not fear, but the rare look of a man confronted with something that defied his understanding of the possible. The scream faded, leaving a silence more profound than any I had experienced. Harrington had collapsed against a shelf, white-faced and trembling. The third scream, he whispered. God help us all. Chapter 3. Deciphering Darkness. The silence that followed the unearthly scream seemed to stretch indefinitely. Inspector Lestrade had gone ashen, his customary skepticism momentarily abandoned. Harrington remained slumped against the shelving, muttering incoherently. Only Holmes maintained his composure, though I noticed a slight tremor in his hands as he bent once more over the manuscript. Most curious, he said finally, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Watson, your medical opinion on this phenomenon? I cleared my throat, struggling to find rational ground. Some form of acoustical anomaly, perhaps. The structure of this vault, combined with the rain patterns. Even to my own ears, the explanation sounded hollow. A reasonable hypothesis, Holmes replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He carefully closed the manuscript case and secured the clasps. Mr. Harrington, I shall need to examine this in greater detail. We will take it with us to Baker Street. This roused Harrington from his stupor. Remove it from the vault? I couldn't possibly authorize 2 men are dead, Mr. Harrington. Holmes interrupted sharply. Would you prefer to be the third? Whatever connection exists between this manuscript and these deaths, I cannot unravel it within the confines of this vault. Lestrade stepped forward. Now see here, Holmes. This is police evidence in an ongoing investigation. Then, by all means, Inspector, accompany us back to Baker Street. Your presence would be most welcome. Holmes's tone softened slightly. Lestrade, you know my methods. Give me 24 hours with this manuscript, and I promise you will have answers. The inspector hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. 24 hours, Holmes. Not a minute more. As we prepared to depart, I noticed Holmes surreptitiously collecting several small samples from around the vault. Dust from a shelf, fibres from near where Harrington had stood, and a barely visible residue from the manuscript case itself. He caught my questioning glance and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, signalling discretion. The journey back to Baker Street was tense and largely silent. Harrington insisted on accompanying us, claiming he would not be able to sleep, regardless. The rain had subsided to a persistent drizzle, tapping an irregular rhythm on the roof of our hansom cab. Back in our rooms, Holmes immediately cleared his chemical apparatus from the dining table, creating space for the manuscript. Mrs. Hudson, despite the late hour, brought tea, eyeing our strange company and Holmes's intense expression with the practiced resignation of one long accustomed to unusual proceedings. Now, Holmes said once we were settled, let us examine what we know. 2 men have died under identical circumstances, apparently from fright. Both had connection to this manuscript. Both died during rainfall. And both, if Mr. Harrington's account is accurate, died following the sound of an inexplicable scream. Which we ourselves have now witnessed, I added. Indeed. Holmes carefully opened the manuscript case again. The question is whether the scream is cause or effect. Surely you don't believe this manuscript is actually haunted? Lestrade asked, unable to keep the incredulity from his voice. I believe in observation and deduction, Inspector. Nothing more, nothing less. Holmes had begun to examine each page methodically, occasionally making notes. Mr. Harrington, what do you know of Lord Blackwood's interest in this document? Harrington shifted uncomfortably. He was a collector of occult texts, though he approached them from a scholarly perspective. He claimed this particular manuscript contained a cipher that, once decoded, would reveal the location of something he called the architect's eye. And what might that be? I asked. I'm not certain. Lord Blackwood was rather secretive about his research. But he did mention once that whoever possessed the architect's eye would see the framework of creation itself. Holmes suddenly straightened, his attention caught by something on the current page. Watson, your medical knowledge might be useful here. What do you make of this illustration? I leaned closer, studying the diagram Holmes indicated. It depicted what appeared to be a human eye, but surrounded by concentric circles filled with anatomical drawings of other body parts, all connected by lines of incomprehensible text. It resembles ancient anatomical studies, I said slowly, but the proportions are wrong. and these connections between organs make no physiological sense. Precisely, Holmes murmured. And yet, there is a mathematical precision to the arrangement. He turned to Harrington. You mentioned a Professor Hamilton examined this document. What is his field of expertise? Cryptography and ancient languages. He's considered the foremost authority on medieval ciphers. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. We shall need to speak with him, and with Lady Blackwood as well. He carefully turned another page, revealing more bizarre illustrations. Most interesting. The cipher appears to change subtly from page to page, yet maintains internal consistency. As Holmes continued his examination, I noticed Harrington watching him with an expression I could not quite decipher, somewhere between hope and dread. Lestrade had dozed off in his chair, the events of the night having exhausted even his professional vigilance. Holmes, I said quietly, do you have a theory? Several, Watson, each more improbable than the last. He looked up, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight. But one thing is becoming clear. This manuscript was never meant to be read. It was designed to be solved. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and with it came the first patter of renewed rainfall. Harrington started violently, his teacup clattering to the floor. "The rain," he whispered. "It's starting again." Chapter 4. The Widow's Tale. We all froze as the rain intensified, drumming against the windows of our Baker Street lodgings with increasing vigour. Harrington had pressed himself against the far wall, eyes wild with terror. Lestrade, now fully awake, watched the manuscript as if expecting it to levitate before our very eyes. Holmes alone seemed unaffected by the growing tension, continuing his methodical examination of the strange document. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The ink appears to change under different light conditions." I was about to respond when the expected horror arrived. The same unearthly scream pierced the air, seeming to emanate from the manuscript itself, yet something was different this time. The sound was fainter, more distant, almost as if "it's weakening," Holmes said, voicing my thoughts. He looked up, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "Or rather, its connection is weakening." "What do you mean?" Lestrade demanded, having nearly jumped out of his skin at the sound. "This manuscript is not the source, Inspector. It is merely a conduit." Holmes carefully closed the case. "We are dealing with something far more elaborate than a haunted document." Harrington had slumped into a chair, trembling violently. "But the scream is undeniably real, yes. But notice how its intensity has diminished since removing the manuscript from the library." Holmes stood, pacing the room with renewed energy. "No, gentlemen, we are confronting a most ingenious deception. One that relies on scientific principles rather than supernatural forces. Scientific principles cannot explain a document that screams, Holmes," I countered. "Can they not?" His eyes twinkled. "Watson, recall our case involving the mechanical Mozart. The principles at work here may be similar, if considerably more advanced." Lestrade looked utterly lost. "Mechanical what?" "A case that never reached your desk, Inspector," Holmes replied. "Suffice it to say, technology can create illusions that seem supernatural to the uninformed observer." Holmes turned to Harrington. We shall need to speak with Lady Blackwood first thing tomorrow morning. For tonight, I suggest you remain here where we can observe any further phenomena. Watson, would you be good enough to make up the spare room?" The night passed without further incident, though I doubt any of us slept soundly. By morning, the rain had ceased, and a weak autumn sun struggled to penetrate the London fog. Holmes had apparently been up for hours, judging by the stack of reference books piled beside the manuscript and the fresh chemical burns on his fingertips. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me as I emerged from my room. "Ready for a journey to Blackwood Manor?" Lestrade had departed earlier, extracting a promise from Holmes to report any significant discoveries. Harrington, looking somewhat recovered after a night without screams, insisted on accompanying us to meet Lady Blackwood. Blackwood Manor stood on the outskirts of London, an imposing Georgian edifice surrounded by unkempt gardens. The place had a neglected air about it, as if the house itself mourned its master. We were received by a solemn butler who led us to a dimly lit drawing-room where Lady Eleanor Blackwood awaited. She was younger than I had expected, perhaps 35, with striking features and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual sadness. She wore her widow's weeds with a certain defiance that suggested the garments were more a social obligation than a reflection of her grief. "Mr. Holmes," she acknowledged with a nod. "I've been expecting you since I heard of Dr. Fairfield's unfortunate demise. You anticipated my involvement, Lady Blackwood?" Holmes inquired, taking the seat she offered. "My husband spoke highly of your analytical abilities, Mr. Holmes. He once remarked that if anyone could unravel the cipher, it would be you." She glanced at the leather case Holmes carried. "I see you've brought it with you. Your husband was attempting to decode this manuscript before his death," Holmes stated. "What can you tell us about his research?" Lady Blackwood's composure faltered slightly. "Montgomery was obsessed with it. He claimed it contained directions to an artifact of immense power, the architect's eye." "And what precisely is this eye?" Holmes pressed. "According to legend, it's a device created by a 15th century alchemist named Ambrose Thornfield. Montgomery believed it could alter perception in some fundamental way." She hesitated. "He said it would allow the bearer to see the mathematical principles underlying reality itself." Holmes leaned forward. "And did your husband make progress in his decryption efforts?" "Considerable progress, yes. In fact, the night he died—" She paused, collecting herself. "The night he died, he was exultant. He claimed to have solved the final piece of the puzzle." "And yet you donated the manuscript to the Thornfield Library rather than continuing his work," Holmes observed. A shadow crossed her face. "But I wanted nothing more to do with it, not after what I saw." "Which was?" Holmes prompted gently. "The manuscript began to change. The illustrations seemed to move when Montgomery decoded certain passages. And then there was the screaming." She shuddered. "Always during the rain, as if water activated something within the ink itself." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Lady Blackwood, would you permit me to see your husband's study and his notes on the decryption?" "His notes were stolen the day after his death," she replied. "The study was ransacked. The police believed it was common burglars, but nothing else of value was taken." "Most interesting," Holmes murmured. "The study, then?" Lady Blackwood led us through the house to a large room lined with bookshelves. Unlike the rest of the manor, this room showed signs of recent use. A lamp still sat on the desk, papers were arranged in neat stacks, and the chair was pulled out as if Lord Blackwood had just stepped away momentarily. "I've kept it exactly as it was," Lady Blackwood explained. "I couldn't bear to disturb it." As Holmes began his examination of the study, I noticed Harrington lingering near the doorway, his gaze fixed not on the room, but on Lady Blackwood herself, with an intensity that struck me as peculiar. Outside, clouds began to gather once more, promising another downpour, and with it, perhaps, another scream. Chapter 5. Shadows in the study Holmes moved about Lord Blackwood's study with the precision of a bloodhound, pausing occasionally to examine items of interest through his magnifying glass. I had witnessed this ritual countless times before, yet it never ceased to fascinate me how he could extract volumes of information from what appeared, to my eyes, as mere trifles. "Lady Blackwood," he said suddenly, "your husband was left-handed, was he not?" She blinked in surprise. "Yes, he was. How did you—" The wear pattern on his desk blotter, the positioning of the inkwell, the slight smudging on the left edges of his book pages, all indicative of a left-handed individual. Holmes turned his attention to a particular shelf of books. He had a special interest in medieval alchemy, I observe. It was his passion, she confirmed, particularly the works of Ambrose Thornfield. "The same Thornfield after whom the library is named?" I inquired. "The very same," Harrington interjected, seeming eager to demonstrate his knowledge. Ambrose Thornfield was both an alchemist and a mathematician. He disappeared in 1462 under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a substantial collection of manuscripts that formed the original core of the library. Holmes had moved to the desk, where he began examining a series of curious indentations on its surface. "Lord Blackwood appears to have been working on some form of physical puzzle here," he murmured. "See these markings, Watson? Consistent with the placement of small objects in a specific pattern." I peered at the marks he indicated, subtle depressions in the wood, arranged in what seemed to be a geometric configuration. "Montgomery had a set of brass tokens," Lady Blackwood offered. "Circular discs with strange symbols. He would arrange them while studying the manuscript." "And where are these tokens now?" Holmes asked sharply. "Gone," she replied. "Taken along with his notes in the burglary." Outside, a rumble of thunder announced the arrival of the promised rain. Harrington visibly tensed, his eyes darting nervously to the windows as the first drops began to patter against the glass. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated by this development. "Excellent timing," he declared, producing the manuscript case from his coat. "With your permission, Lady Blackwood, I should like to conduct an experiment." Before she could respond, Holmes had opened the case and spread several pages of the manuscript across Lord Blackwood's desk. "Observe carefully," he instructed us. "If my theory is correct, the rain intensified rapidly, and with it came a change in the manuscript pages. The ink, which had appeared faded and brown, began to darken, the symbols becoming more pronounced. Most remarkably, certain illustrations on the pages seemed to shift slightly, as if the figures were breathing. "Good Lord," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from the phenomenon. "A chemical reaction activated by moisture in the air," Holmes explained. "Ingenious, really. The ink must contain compounds that respond to specific atmospheric conditions. But the screaming? Harrington protested. How does chemistry explain that? As if in answer to his question, a low, undulating moan began to build. Unlike the previous screams, this sound grew gradually, seemingly emanating from the very walls of the study. Lady Blackwood pressed her hands to her ears, her face contorted in distress. Holmes, meanwhile, had dropped to his knees, examining the floorboards beneath, the desk with intense concentration. "As I suspected," he announced, his voice raised to be heard over the increasingly disturbing sound. "Lady Blackwood, is there a space beneath this room? A cellar, perhaps?" "Yes," she managed to reply. "My husband had an underground laboratory. Constructed. The entrance is through the library next door." Without waiting for further explanation, Holmes sprang to his feet. "Show me, quickly!" Lady Blackwood led us through a connecting door into an equally impressive library, where she activated a hidden mechanism behind a particular bookshelf. The shelf swung outward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. "I haven't been down there since," she faltered. "Since your husband's death," Holmes completed for her. "Understandable, but I must insist we descend now." Producing a dark lantern from his seemingly bottomless coat pocket, Holmes led the way down the stairs. The moaning sound grew louder as we descended, taking on a more mechanical quality that somehow made it all the more unsettling. The laboratory below was a marvel of both ancient and modern scientific equipment. Glass retorts and alembics shared space with electrical apparatus I did not recognize. At the center of the room stood a curious device, a brass construction resembling an astronomical orrery, but with additional components that defied easy categorization. Holmes moved directly to this device, examining it with evident fascination. "The source of our supernatural phenomenon," he declared. "See here, Watson. These pipes are designed to channel sound when activated by vibrations from above. And this mechanism..." He traced a connection to what appeared to be a primitive form of gramophone, sound reproduction triggered by specific frequencies. The moaning had reached a crescendo that made further conversation difficult. Holmes quickly located a valve on the device and turned it decisively. The sound cut off with an abruptness that left a ringing silence in its wake. "A remarkable invention," Holmes said into the quiet. "Lord Blackwood created a system that would react to the manuscript being decoded. The sound was likely meant as a warning, or perhaps a confirmation of correct interpretation." Lady Blackwood had remained on the stairs, unwilling to fully enter the laboratory. Montgomery claimed he was close to rebuilding what Thornfield had created centuries ago, she said. He called it acoustic alchemy, the transformation of sound into physical effect. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then suddenly froze, his attention caught by something on a workbench near the wall. He moved swiftly to examine it. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, following his gaze. "Evidence, Watson," he replied softly, "that we are not the first to visit this laboratory since Lord Blackwood's demise." On the dusty surface, clearly visible in the lantern light, was a fresh handprint. Chapter 6. The Professor's warning. Holmes carefully measured the mysterious handprint with a small tape he produced from his waistcoat pocket, jotting the dimensions in his notebook. A man's hand, larger than average. The pressure pattern indicates someone of considerable physical strength. Could it belong to the burglar who stole Lord Blackwood's notes? I suggested. Possibly, though the dust accumulation suggests this visit occurred more recently, within the past 48 hours, I should say. Holmes ran his finger around the edge of the print without touching it. Most curious is the residue. Do you see it, Watson? I leaned closer and noticed a faint silvery powder along the outline of the fingers. Some chemical substance? Indeed. One I've encountered before in my studies of metallurgical processes. Holmes straightened up, his expression grave. Lady Blackwood, when did you last enter this laboratory? Not since the day after Montgomery's death, she replied without hesitation. I couldn't bear to... She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening as she registered the implication of Holmes's question. Someone has been here, in our home? So it would appear. Holmes began a more thorough examination of the laboratory, paying particular attention to the central device. This machine, your husband built it himself? Yes, though based on designs he found in Thornfield's writings. He called it a resonance engine. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. The craftsmanship is remarkable. The ability to create sounds that propagate through specific architectural structures, activated by atmospheric conditions. Your husband was a man of considerable scientific talent, Lady Blackwood. He was brilliant, she acknowledged, a touch of pride briefly displacing her anxiety. Too brilliant, perhaps. There were those who thought his work dangerous. In what way? Holmes inquired, his attention now focused on a row of notebooks on a nearby shelf. Montgomery believed that sound, at certain frequencies and patterns, could affect physical matter, even alter its fundamental properties. She shuddered slightly. In his final weeks, he claimed to have discovered vibrations that could influence the human mind directly. Harrington, who had been uncharacteristically silent during our descent and exploration, suddenly spoke up. The architect's eye was said to be a device that could translate such vibrations into visible patterns, allowing one to literally see sound and its effects on the physical world. Holmes turned to him with a sharp look. You seem well informed on the subject, Mr. Harrington. Merely professional interest, the curator replied, somewhat defensively. Lord Blackwood discussed his theories with me when arranging for the manuscript to come to the library after his death. Did he indeed? Holmes murmured. How curious that he would plan for its donation while still actively researching it. Lady Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. It was my suggestion, Mr. Holmes. I feared what might happen if Montgomery actually succeeded in his work. The manuscript was to be sealed in the library vault, inaccessible except to authorized scholars. A wise precaution, perhaps, Holmes conceded, though evidently insufficient to prevent tragedy. The rain had intensified above us, its drumming on the manor roof creating an ominous backdrop to our conversation. Holmes, seeming to reach a decision, carefully gathered the manuscript pages he had brought down and returned them to their case. I believe our next step is clear, he announced. We must consult with Professor Hamilton, the cryptography expert who examined the manuscript. His insights may prove invaluable. But first, he turned to Lady Blackwood. I would ask your permission to remove a small sample from this laboratory for chemical analysis. It may help identify our mysterious visitor. With her consent secured, and a sample of the silvery residue safely stored in a small vial, we departed Blackwood Manor as the storm reached its full intensity. The journey to Oxford, where Professor Hamilton maintained his rooms at Magdalen College, was conducted in conditions that would have deterred less determined travellers. Harrington had insisted on accompanying us, claiming his curatorial responsibility for the manuscript demanded his presence. I noted that Holmes observed him with increased attention throughout our journey, though he refrained from voicing whatever suspicions he might be harbouring. Professor Thaddeus Hamilton proved to be a small, energetic man, with spectacles that magnified his eyes to owlish proportions. He received us in a cluttered study that resembled a paper explosion more than an academic's quarters. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, pumping my friend's hand vigorously. "This is an honour, sir. Your monograph on the decipherment of ancient pictographic systems was most illuminating." "You flatter me, Professor," Holmes replied, "though I suspect your own contributions to the field far outstrip my amateur efforts." Once introductions were complete, and we were settled with tea that the Professor had somehow excavated from beneath a tower of manuscripts, Holmes broached the purpose of our visit. "You examined the Blackwood manuscript recently, I understand." The shy Professor's demeanour changed instantly, his enthusiasm giving way to a guarded expression. "Yes, a most disturbing document. I advised Mr. Harrington that it should remain sealed." "Why?" Holmes asked simply. "Because, Mr. Holmes, it is not merely a cipher, it is a key." The Professor leaned forward, lowering his voice despite the privacy of his chambers. "The symbols constitute what cryptographers call a transformative cipher, one that alters the very medium upon which it is recorded." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Alters it how, precisely?" "That is what I cannot say with certainty, but Lord Blackwood was convinced it could reshape reality itself when properly decoded." Professor Hamilton removed his spectacles, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. "I thought it scientific nonsense until I witnessed the ink moving on the page during a rainstorm. After that, I burned my notes and warned Blackwood to do the same." "A warning he evidently ignored," Holmes observed. "To his peril," Hamilton agreed solemnly, "and now others have paid the same price for curiosity." Holmes fixed the Professor with a penetrating gaze. "What aren't you telling us, Professor Hamilton?" The academic hesitated, then reached into his desk drawer. "This arrived yesterday. I believe you should see it." He produced a letter bearing a black wax seal with a curious symbol pressed into it, a circle containing what appeared to be an eye. Chapter 7. The architect's warning, Holmes accepted the letter from Professor Hamilton with gloved hands, examining the black wax seal closely before carefully breaking it. The parchment within was of a quality rarely seen in modern correspondence. Thick and cream-coloured, with a subtle texture that spoke of traditional craftsmanship. "Curious," Holmes murmured. "This paper is new, yet manufactured using 15th century techniques." He unfolded the letter and began to read, his expression growing increasingly grave with each line. "What does it say?" I prompted when he had finished. Rather than answering directly, Holmes handed me the letter. The handwriting was elegant but distinctly foreign in its flourishes. "Professor Hamilton, you were wise to cease your inquiries into the Thornfield cipher. Others have not shown similar prudence. The deaths at the library are but a prelude to greater calamity. Should the decryption continue, the architect's eye was sealed away for reasons beyond your comprehension. Its power to reshape the fundamental vibrations of matter was never meant for human possession. Be warned, those who pursue this knowledge further will face the consequences of tampering with forces beyond mortal understanding. The Brotherhood of Resonance has protected this secret for centuries, and will not hesitate to silence those who threaten its containment. Abandon your association with the manuscript, and destroy any notes you have made. This is your only warning. The letter was unsigned, but where a signature might have been expected, was drawn the same symbol that appeared on the seal. A stylized eye within a perfect circle. The Brotherhood of Resonance, Harrington said, reading over my shoulder. I've never encountered that name in any historical record. Nor would you, Professor Hamilton replied, reclaiming the letter with trembling hands. They exist only in obscure footnotes and whispered rumors among certain academic circles. A secret society supposedly founded by Ambrose Thornfield's disciples, dedicated to guarding his most dangerous discoveries. Holmes had been pacing the small study, his chin tucked to his chest in characteristic contemplation. A fascinating attempt at intimidation, he remarked, but one that raises more questions than it answers. You believe the letter to be fraudulent? I asked. I believe it to be deliberately theatrical, Watson. The archaic paper, the melodramatic warnings, the convenient secret society, all calculated to inspire fear rather than rational investigation. Holmes turned to Hamilton. Has anyone else received similar correspondence? Lady Blackwood, perhaps? The professor looked startled. I couldn't say. This arrived only yesterday, and I've spoken to no one about it. And yet, Holmes continued, it references the deaths at the library, information that had not been widely publicized when this letter would have been sent. He examined the envelope. Posted in London 2 days ago. Most interesting. Harrington had gone notably pale. Mr. Holmes, do you believe there truly is some organization willing to kill to protect this secret? I believe there is someone with a vested interest in the manuscript who wishes us to believe exactly that. Holmes fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Tell me, Mr. Harrington, when did you first notice the manuscript's unusual properties? What? I told you, when Lord Blackwood's widow delivered it to the library. And yet the first death occurred only recently, despite the manuscript having been in the library's possession for a month. Holmes's voice remained conversational, but I recognized the precision of his questioning. Why do you suppose that is? I couldn't say, Harrington replied, his discomfort visibly increasing. Perhaps something activated it, or someone began to decipher it, Holmes suggested. Professor Hamilton, in your expert opinion, how difficult would this cipher be to crack? The professor considered the question. Extraordinarily difficult without the proper key. Lord Blackwood spent years studying Thornfield's work before making any progress. Even then, he required some kind of physical component, tokens or tools, that worked in conjunction with the text. The brass tokens Lady Blackwood mentioned, I recalled. Precisely, Holmes nodded. Now stolen, along with Blackwood's notes. He turned back to Hamilton. Professor, I must ask you to recall anything Lord Blackwood might have shared about his decryption methods. Any detail, however insignificant it seemed at the time. Hamilton removed his spectacles, polishing them nervously. He spoke of a mathematical progression, a sequence of tones represented by the symbols. He believed the manuscript wasn't meant to be read so much as performed. Performed? I echoed. Like a musical score, but with frequencies beyond human hearing. Frequencies that could affect physical matter. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular light I knew so well. The thrill of pieces falling into place. Of course, the manuscript isn't the key itself. It's the instructions for creating the key. He spun toward Harrington. The library. Does it house any of Thornfield's original musical instruments or acoustic devices? Harrington appeared taken aback by the sudden question. Yes, in the historical collection. A set of crystal bowls, some tuning forks, and what's purported to be Thornfield's own symphonic harmonizer, though no one has been able to determine its purpose. We must return to London immediately, Holmes declared. I believe I now understand what Lord Blackwood discovered, and why he died for it. As we prepared to depart, the professor caught Holmes's arm. Mr. Holmes, I beg you to exercise caution. Whether this brotherhood is real or not, the danger certainly is. The manuscript's effects cannot be explained by conventional science. Fear not, Professor, Holmes replied with a confident smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Science merely awaits proper explanation for what appears to be supernatural. I intend to provide that explanation before another life is claimed. The journey back to London was conducted in relative silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The rain had finally ceased, leaving a thick mist that clung to the countryside like a spectral shroud. I observed that Harrington repeatedly checked his pocket watch, his anxiety seemingly increasing as we neared the city. Holmes, for his part, spent the time examining the manuscript through his magnifying glass, occasionally muttering to himself and making notations in his pocket journal. Only once did he break his concentration to remark, "Watson, do you recall that curious case in Cornwall? The one involving the lighthouse keeper's death and the peculiar patterns of light?" "Vaguely," I admitted, puzzled by the apparent non sequitur. "It may prove more relevant than I initially thought." He returned to his examination without elaboration, leaving me, as was often the case, several steps behind his racing intellect. As our train approached London, the skies darkened once more with the promise of renewed rainfall, and with it perhaps another scream. Chapter 8. The trap is set o'er train, pulled into the smoke-filled cavern of Paddington Station as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. London had donned its most forbidding aspect, gas lamps creating islands of wan light in a sea of fog and shadow, the streets emptied of all but the most desperate or determined pedestrians. Holmes hailed a cab immediately, instructing the driver to take us directly to the Thornfield Library. Should we not inform Inspector Lestrade? I ventured as we rattled through the increasingly wet streets. All in good time, Watson, Holmes replied. I wish to examine Thornfield's instruments first, without the well-meaning interference of Scotland Yard. Harrington, seated across from us, had grown increasingly agitated as we approached our destination. Mr. Holmes, the library will be closed at this hour. The security guard, Minton, is the only person present. Then Mr. Minton shall have to accommodate us, Holmes said with finality. This is, after all, a matter of life and death. The The library loomed before us like a mausoleum, its grand architecture rendered ominous by the combination of darkness and deluge. A single light burned in what I presume to be the security office near the entrance. Holmes rapped sharply on the massive oak door, the sound almost lost in the drumming of the rain. After a considerable wait, the door creaked open to reveal a burly man with a suspicious expression and a large ring of keys at his belt. "Library's closed," he announced gruffly. "Come back tomorrow." "Mr. Minton, I presume?" Holmes produced a card from his waistcoat. "Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson, and of course you know Mr. Harrington. We require immediate access to the historical instruments collection." Minton's eyes widened in recognition of Holmes's name, but his stance remained obstinate. "Can't do it, sir. Strict orders after what happened to Dr. Fairfield. No one's to enter alone, especially not at night." "We are hardly alone, Mr. Minton," Holmes observed. "There are 4 of us, and I assure you the danger lies in delay rather than action." Harrington stepped forward. "It's all right, Minton. I authorize this as curator. The responsibility is mine." The guard hesitated, then reluctantly swung the door wider. "On your head be it, sir, but I'll be accompanying you." The library took on an entirely different character at night, the towering shelves creating canyons of darkness, the occasional flash of lightning through the high windows throwing grotesque shadows across marble floors. Our footsteps echoed with unnerving volume as Minton led us through the main hall and down a corridor to a less grand wing of the building. "The historical collection," he announced, unlocking a set of double doors. Inside was a museum-like space, filled with glass cases containing an eclectic assortment of artifacts. Holmes moved immediately to a central display, where a collection of crystal bowls of varying sizes was arranged alongside what appeared to be elaborate tuning forks mounted on resonance boxes. "Thornfield's acoustic instruments," Harrington confirmed, "though no one has used them in centuries. They're considered too fragile." Holmes examined the display case carefully. "This lock has been picked recently," he declared, pointing to almost imperceptible scratches around the keyhole. "Quite expertly, I might add." Minton stepped forward with alarm. "Impossible! I check these displays every night on my rounds." "When did you last examine this particular case, Mr. Minton?" Holmes inquired. The guard frowned in concentration. 3 days ago, I suppose. We've been short-staffed since—" He trailed off, unwilling to directly reference the recent deaths. "Exactly as I suspected," Holmes murmured. He turned to Harrington. "The key, if you please. I must examine these instruments immediately." With visible reluctance, Harrington produced a small key from his chain. "These are priceless artifacts, Mr. Holmes. I must insist on the utmost care." "Naturally," Holmes agreed, accepting the key. He opened the case with a surgeon's delicacy and lifted out the largest of the crystal bowls. "Watson, your medical bag, if you would." I handed him my bag, from which he extracted a stethoscope. To my bewilderment, he placed the diaphragm against the bowl and tapped the rim lightly with a small metal instrument from his pocket. "Fascinating," he murmured after listening intently. "Now the next one, if you please." Holmes repeated this procedure with each bowl, making notes after each examination. Finally, he turned his attention to what Harrington had called the symphonic harmonizer, a brass device resembling a complex astrolabe with multiple rotating rings. This, Holmes declared, is the key to the entire affair. What do you mean? I asked. This device, when properly configured according to the instructions in the manuscript, creates a specific pattern of vibrations. Lord Blackwood had begun to decipher those instructions, and someone has continued his work with deadly results. The rain had intensified to a thunderous downpour, drowning out all other sounds. Holmes carefully repositioned the artifacts and locked the case. Mr. Harrington, I believe it's time we examine the manuscript in conjunction with these instruments. Not here. There's insufficient space and too many valuable items at risk. The main reading room would be more suitable. Now, in this storm? Harrington protested. Precisely because of this storm, Holmes insisted. The conditions must be identical to those when the previous deaths occurred. With obvious misgivings, Harrington led us to the grand reading room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive oak table surrounded by uncomfortable-looking chairs. Minton busied himself lighting additional lamps, while Holmes carefully removed the manuscript from its case. Now, Holmes said once we were all seated, I shall require absolute silence as I work through the sequence I believe Lord Blackwood discovered. For the next half hour, we watched in tense silence as Holmes meticulously compared pages of the manuscript to diagrams he had drawn of the crystal bowls and harmonizer. Occasionally, he would make calculations in his notebook or hold pages up to the lamplight to observe how the ink responded to the illumination. Watson, he said at last, would you be good enough to retrieve my travelling case from the cab? It contains certain instruments I shall need for the final phase of this investigation. As I rose to comply, Holmes turned to Harrington. Mr. Harrington, I believe I now understand how the cipher functions. It is indeed a musical score of sorts, but one designed to create patterns of vibration beyond human perception. And the screaming? Harrington asked. A byproduct of certain frequencies interacting with the architecture of this building, and of Blackwood Manor. Ingenious, really. Thornfield designed his cipher to be decipherable only in specific locations built to his specifications. Holmes's eyes gleamed with intellectual appreciation. The manuscript doesn't merely contain the instructions. It is physically altered by the correct sequence of vibrations, revealing hidden text. I departed to retrieve Holmes's case, hurrying through the rain-soaked night. Upon my return, dripping and chilled to the bone, I found the reading room's atmosphere had changed palpably. Holmes had arranged several of his own instruments on the table, a small tuning device, a metronome, and what appeared to be a modified camera. Ah, Watson, excellent timing, Holmes greeted me. I am about to recreate the conditions that led to our unfortunate victim's demise, with one crucial difference. He lowered his voice. We shall be prepared for the consequences. Holmes then addressed the room at large. Gentlemen, I believe I can now demonstrate how this cipher was meant to be decoded. More importantly, I can reveal who has been using it for murderous purposes. He fixed Minton with a steady gaze. Would you be good enough to secure all entrances to this room? I suspect we may receive an uninvited visitor once we begin. As Minton moved to check the doors, Holmes leaned close to me. Be ready, Watson. When I give the signal, extinguish all lamps except the one nearest the manuscript. And whatever happens, do not take your eyes from Mr. Harrington. Harrington? I whispered in surprise. You suspect him? Holmes's expression was unreadable. "I suspect everyone, my dear Watson. But I know with certainty that one person in this room understands far more about the architect's eye than they have admitted. And before this night is through, they will reveal themselves, one way or another." Chapter 9. Resonance and Revelation. The reading room had taken on the atmosphere of a séance, with the rain beating a relentless percussion against the high windows and lightning occasionally casting stark, momentary illumination across our tense faces. Minton had checked the doors as instructed, and now stood uncertainly near the entrance, his eyes darting between Holmes and the manuscript. "Is everyone prepared?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, despite the palpable tension. When no objections were raised, he nodded to me. "Watson, if you would." I moved around the room, extinguishing the lamps one by one, until only the one nearest the manuscript remained, casting a small island of amber light in a sea of shadows. Holmes positioned himself at the head of the table and carefully arranged the pages of the manuscript in what appeared to be a specific sequence. "What I am about to demonstrate," he began, "is the result of combining several disciplines: acoustics, chemistry, and cryptography. Ambrose Thornfield was centuries ahead of his time, understanding principles of resonant frequency that modern science is only now beginning to explore." Holmes removed from his travelling case what appeared to be a small silver tuning fork. "This is calibrated to the precise frequency that activates the chemical compounds in the manuscript's ink. Observe." He struck the fork against the table edge and held it over the first page. To my astonishment, the ink began to shift before our eyes, symbols rearranging themselves into new configurations. Harrington gasped audibly. "The manuscript responds to specific frequencies," Holmes explained. "Lord Blackwood discovered this principle and used his resonance engine to amplify the effect. But the true genius of Thornfield's design is this." He indicated the newly formed patterns. "Each new configuration provides the frequency for the next page, creating a progressive sequence that can only be followed correctly with the proper instruments." Holmes proceeded methodically through several pages, each transformation more dramatic than the last. The rain intensified further, and I became aware of a subtle vibration in the floor beneath us. "The building itself is part of the cipher," Holmes continued. "Thornfield designed his library, and by extension Blackwood Manor, which was built on the same principles, to amplify certain frequencies when atmospheric conditions are correct. Rain of sufficient intensity completes the circuit, so to speak." "And the screaming?" Harrington asked, his voice unnaturally strained. "A harmonic byproduct," Holmes replied. "When the correct sequence is achieved, the resonance creates sound, waves at the threshold of human hearing, disturbing but not in themselves harmful." As if summoned by his explanation, a low moaning began to build around us. Unlike the previous screams, this one developed gradually, rising from barely perceptible to uncomfortably present. Minton crossed himself nervously. "Gentlemen, remain calm," Holmes instructed. "This is precisely what we expected." The manuscript pages were now transforming rapidly, the ink flowing like liquid mercury to create entirely new diagrams. At the center of each page, an identical symbol was forming, the eye within a circle we had seen on Professor Hamilton's letter. The architect's eye. Harrington whispered reverently. Holmes nodded. The symbol of Thornfield's greatest discovery and his greatest fear. What he found was a method to alter human perception through specific patterns of sound and light. In the wrong hands, such knowledge could be used to manipulate minds, to create illusions indistinguishable from reality. The moaning sound had reached a crescendo that made further conversation difficult. Holmes gestured for me to cover my ears, then raised his voice. This is how Lord Blackwood and Dr. Fairfield died. Not from supernatural forces, but from a carefully orchestrated attack on their senses. Specific frequencies can induce terror so profound that the heart simply stops. As Holmes spoke, I kept my attention fixed on Harrington as instructed. The curator's reaction was most peculiar, rather than showing fear at the mounting supernatural display. His expression reflected intense concentration, his lips moving silently as if counting. A sudden flash of lightning was followed by an immediate crash of thunder directly overhead, plunging us momentarily into complete darkness as the final lamp flickered out. When it re-established itself, I saw Harrington's hand moving surreptitiously toward the manuscript. "Holmes!" I called in warning, but my friend was already in motion. "Now, Watson," he cried, and I knew what he meant to do. I lunged across the table, seizing Harrington's wrist before he could touch the pages. The curator fought with surprising strength, his scholarly demeanor vanishing in an instant. "Minton!" Holmes shouted. "The doors!" But the security guard, instead of securing the exits, was moving purposefully toward us, something metallic gleaming in his hand. Holmes, with characteristic quickness, intercepted him. Deflecting what I now saw was a brass letter, opener wielded as a weapon. "As I suspected," Holmes declared, grappling with the larger man. "Conspirators, both of you." The moaning sound had taken on a new quality, less disorienting and more focused, as if gathering itself for some crescendo. The manuscript pages were now glowing with a faint phosphorescent light that cast grotesque shadows across the combatants' faces. Breaking free from my grip, Harrington scrambled toward the manuscript. "You don't understand," he cried. "It must be completed. The sequence must be finished." Holmes, having momentarily subdued Minton with a precise blow to the solar plexus, turned toward the curator. "On the contrary, Mr. Harrington, I understand perfectly. You've been working to complete Lord Blackwood's research. Research that Lady Blackwood wisely attempted to suppress." "She is a fool," Harrington spat, his refined manner completely abandoned. Her husband stood on the precipice of the greatest discovery in human history, and she sought to bury it out of superstitious fear. Holmes advanced on him cautiously. "Not superstition, Mr. Harrington. Wisdom. The architect's eye was hidden away because Thornfield himself recognized its dangers. The power to alter perception is the power to control minds. To elevate them," Harrington countered passionately. "To open humanity's eyes to realities beyond our limited senses." The manuscript's glow had intensified to an almost painful brightness. The moaning sound now seemed to come from within the pages themselves, forming what almost sounded like words in a language I could not comprehend. "You killed Lord Blackwood," Holmes stated flatly. "Not directly, perhaps, but you manipulated his research, pushed him to test frequencies you knew might be dangerous." Harrington's laugh was chilling. Blackwood was weak. He hesitated when confronted with true power. His eyes gleamed with fanatical light. Fairfield was the same, accessing the manuscript vault without understanding what he was dealing with. Nishian had manoeuvred himself between Harrington and the glowing pages. And the Brotherhood of Resonance, your own invention, I presume, to frighten away potential interference. The Brotherhood is real enough, Harrington snarled, though perhaps not as ancient as I implied to that credulous fool Hamilton. We are the inheritors of Thornfield's true legacy. Minton had recovered and was circling to flank us. I shifted my position to keep both men in view, wishing fervently that I had thought to bring my service revolver. "Watson," Holmes said without taking his eyes from Harrington. "In exactly 30 seconds when I give the signal, overturn the table." I tensed, ready to act, though I had no idea what Holmes intended. The curator seemed to sense something was amiss, for he suddenly lunged towards the manuscript with desperate intensity. "Now, Watson!" Holmes shouted. I threw my weight against the heavy oak table, sending it crashing onto its side. The manuscript pages scattered, their unearthly glow instantly diminishing. The moaning sound cut off with shocking abruptness, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the continuing drumbeat of rain. In the sudden darkness, I heard rather than saw the commotion that followed, running footsteps, a cry of frustration from Harrington, and the sound of breaking glass. Lightning flashed again, revealing the curator halfway through a shattered window. Minton already disappeared, and Holmes in pursuit. "After them, Watson," Holmes called back to me. They must not escape with those pages. Chapter 10. The Chase Through Shadows. I scrambled to my feet, gathering what pages of the manuscript remained scattered across the reading room floor. The rain poured through the shattered window, already soaking the rich carpet beneath it. Hastily stuffing the recovered pages into my coat, I followed Holmes's path through the broken window, mindful of the jagged glass edges. The library grounds were transformed into a phantasmagoric landscape by the storm. Trees bent under the lashing, rain, pathways turned to streaming rivulets, and visibility reduced to mere yards by the combination of darkness and deluge. A flash of lightning illuminated two figures sprinting toward the wrought iron fence that separated the library from the adjacent street. A third figure, Holmes, was in close pursuit. Despite my military experience, I found myself at a disadvantage in this chase. My leg, which occasionally troubled me in inclement weather, chose this most inopportune moment to protest the abuse I was subjecting it to. Nevertheless, I pressed on, determined not to leave Holmes without assistance. By the time I reached the fence, all three men had scaled it and disappeared into the warren of narrow streets beyond. I followed as best I could, guided by occasional glimpses afforded by lightning and the distant shouts that barely carried over the storm's fury. The chase led us into one of London's less reputable districts, a maze of cramped alleyways and looming tenements where gaslights were few and constables fewer. I lost track of Holmes for several heart-stopping minutes before catching sight of his distinctive silhouette turning sharply into a narrow passage between buildings. "Holmes!" I called out, my voice nearly lost in a thunderclap. He paused just long enough for me to catch up, his face appearing eerily pale in another lightning flash. "They've separated," he panted, uncharacteristically winded from the chase. and Minton fled north toward the river, but Harrington is the one we must follow. He has the crucial pages and the knowledge to use them. Where is he headed? I asked, struggling to catch my breath. If my deduction is correct, to the only other place in London where the manuscript's full potential can be realized. Holmes was already moving again, his long legs eating up the distance. The Blackwood Laboratory. You think Lady Blackwood is involved? I gasped as we ran. On the contrary, Watson. I believe she is in grave danger. We emerged onto a broader street where, by some miracle, Holmes managed to hail a passing hansom cab. The driver was reluctant to take on passengers so thoroughly drenched, but the generous fare Holmes offered quickly overcame his hesitation. As we clattered through the storm-lashed streets toward Blackwood Manor, Holmes filled the gaps in the narrative. Harrington has been obsessed with Thornfield's work for years, he explained. When Lord Blackwood began making genuine progress in deciphering the manuscript, Harrington ingratiated himself as a scholarly advisor while secretly pushing Blackwood toward ever more dangerous experiments. But why not simply steal the manuscript from the beginning? I asked, wringing water from my hat. Because he couldn't decipher it alone. He needed Blackwood's expertise and resources. Holmes's expression was grim in the dim light of the cab's interior. When Blackwood finally unlocked the method but hesitated to apply it, fearing the consequences, Harrington arranged for him to experience the full effect of the resonance pattern, resulting in his death from sheer terror. And Dr. Fairfield? Dio. Similar scenario. Fairfield discovered Harrington accessing the manuscript after hours and became suspicious. Harrington eliminated him using the same method. Holmes leaned forward intently. But Lady Blackwood presents a different problem. She knows where her husband hid the completed portions of his work. Information Harrington desperately needs. The implication was clear and chilling. We must hurry then. As we approached Blackwood Manor, a new sound joined the cacophony of the storm, a distant wailing that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was not the scream we had heard before, but something more sustained and somehow more deliberate. He's already activated the resonance engine, Holmes muttered. Driver, faster if you value lives. The cab had barely stopped before we leapt out, racing up the rain-slick steps to the manor's entrance. The door stood ajar, a bad sign. No servants appeared as we entered the darkened hallway. The laboratory, Holmes directed, already moving toward the library that concealed the hidden entrance. The mechanism that opened the secret door had been forced. The elegant bookcase splintered around its hinges. We descended the stone steps, with caution, the eerie wailing growing louder with each step. The laboratory was illuminated by a single oil lamp and the unnatural glow of the manuscript pages Harrington had arranged on the central workbench. Lady Blackwood was there, bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror, but her expression defiant. Harrington stood before the resonance engine, his back to us, as he made adjustments to its brass rings with feverish intensity. The machine emitted the wailing sound, its components rotating at increasing speed. It's over, Harrington, Holmes called out, his voice cutting through the mechanical keening. Scotland Yard is on its way. The curator turned slowly, his face transformed by the strange light into something barely human. In his hand, he held what appeared to be a brass monocle attached to an intricate headpiece. "Mr. Holmes," he acknowledged with unnerving calm, "you're just in time to witness history. The architect's eye is complete at last." "That device won't work as you expect," Holmes warned, edging carefully into the room. "Thornfield built safeguards into his design, contingencies against misuse." Harrington laughed, the sound mingling discordantly with the engine's wail. "Whose safeguards I have bypassed, thanks to Lord Blackwood's final breakthrough." He gestured to Lady Blackwood. His wife was kind enough to reveal where he hid his most crucial notes. Once I demonstrated what the resonance engine could do to the human mind. I moved toward Lady Blackwood, intending to free her, but Harrington raised a warning hand. "I wouldn't, Doctor. The vibrations in this room are currently at the threshold of human tolerance. One adjustment to this dial, and both her mind and yours would shatter like crystal." Holmes had been surveying the laboratory, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "Your Brotherhood colleagues seem to have abandoned you, Harrington. Or did they never exist at all?" "Minton was useful but expendable," Harrington replied dismissively. "As for the Brotherhood, it will exist soon enough, once I demonstrate the power of the eye." With a theatrical flourish, he raised the brass monocle to his eye. "Observe, gentlemen, as I perceive the true nature of reality." The instant the device touched his face, the laboratory's atmosphere changed. The wailing intensified, taking on a pulsing quality that seemed to penetrate my very bones. The manuscript pages began to glow brighter, their symbols swirling and reconfiguring rapidly. Harrington stood transfixed, his body rigid, the hand holding the monocle trembling violently. "I see it," he whispered, his voice transformed into something barely recognizable. "The patterns, the underlying structure. It's beautiful beyond comprehension." Holmes was moving slowly but deliberately toward the resonance engine. "The sheer human mind isn't equipped to process such information, Harrington. Thornfield discovered this too late. It drove him mad." "Madness?" Harrington laughed, the sound increasingly unhinged. "No, this is transcendence. I can see the mathematical foundations of all matter, all thought. I can—" He broke off with a strangled gasp, his free hand clutching at his chest. The moment Holmes had been waiting for came. With lightning reflexes, he lunged forward and wrenched a crucial component from the resonance engine. The wailing changed pitch dramatically, becoming discordant before dying away entirely. The glow from the manuscript pages dimmed instantly. Harrington screamed, not from the machine's influence, but from rage and desperation. "No! Give it back! I was so close!" He staggered toward Holmes, still clutching the monocle to his eye, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I took advantage of the distraction to reach Lady Blackwood and begin working on her bonds. "Are you injured, my lady?" I asked urgently. "No," she replied, her voice steady despite her ordeal. "But be careful. He's not entirely himself anymore." Indeed, Harrington seemed to have undergone some fundamental transformation. His eyes, or rather, the one not covered by the monocle, darted about wildly, focusing on points in empty air, as if tracking invisible movements. "The patterns are breaking down," he moaned, reaching futilely toward Holmes. "I must complete the sequence." Holmes backed away, keeping the engine component out of reach. The sequence was never meant to be completed, Harrington. Thornfield designed it as a warning, not an invitation. With a howl of frustration, Harrington launched himself at Holmes. Despite his scholarly appearance, the curator moved with the desperate strength of a madman, knocking Holmes backward into the workbench. The manuscript pages scattered, some falling perilously close to the oil lamp's flame. "Watson!" Holmes called, out grappling with the frenzied curator. "The pages!" Chapter 11. The Final Resonance. I lunged toward the scattered manuscript pages, snatching them away from the oil lamp's threatening flame. Harrington, seeing my action, gave a howl of desperation and redoubled his attack on Holmes, abandoning all pretense of scholarly restraint. They crashed against the workbench, sending glass apparatus shattering to the floor. "The eye!" Harrington shrieked. "Don't let him damage the eye!" The brass monocle had fallen from his grasp during the struggle, and now lay on the stone floor, its intricate mechanism still intact. I hesitated, torn between retrieving the manuscript pages and securing the dangerous device. "The pages first. Watson!" Holmes called out, correctly interpreting my dilemma as he grappled with the curator. "They're the key to everything." I gathered the remaining pages, tucking them securely inside my coat alongside those I'd recovered from the library. Lady Blackwood, her hands now free though still bound at the ankles, had dragged her chair toward the resonance engine. "Dr. Watson," she called urgently, "we must dismantle it completely. It's the only way to end this madness." Understanding dawned. The brass component Holmes had removed had only temporarily disabled the device. The engine itself remained intact. I moved, too, assist her, but Harrington had seen our intent. With strength born of desperation, he broke free from Holmes's grasp and scrambled toward the fallen monocle. "I won't let you!" he cried, snatching up the device. "Not when I've come so close." Holmes was on his feet in an instant, but Harrington had already retreated to the laboratory's far corner. The monocle clutched protectively to his chest. His appearance had deteriorated alarmingly. Hair wild, clothing torn, and a thin trickle of blood running from his nose. Most disturbing was his gaze, which darted erratically between us and invisible points in the air. "You're ill, Harrington," Holmes said, his voice deliberately calm as he slowly advanced. "The device has affected your mind. Let us help you. Help me." Harrington laughed, the sound brittle and unhinged. "You want to rob mankind of its greatest advancement," Thornfield knew. He saw the patterns underlying all creation. With the eye, we can all see them. Thornfield went mad and vanished, Lady Blackwood countered, still working at the engine with determined fingers. "Just as my husband would have, had he lived." "Your husband was weak," Harrington spat. He feared what he didn't understand. But I understand. I've seen the vibrations that bind reality together. With the manuscript's final sequence, I can manipulate those vibrations, reshape matter, thought, perception itself. While Harrington's attention was divided, Holmes had been inching closer. I positioned myself to block any escape route, though, in truth, I was unsure what we would do with him once captured. His mental state had deteriorated beyond what any asylum could address. Outside, the storm had reached a crescendo, rain hammering against the small windows high in the laboratory walls. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the scene, reflecting off the brass components of the resonance engine and the monocle in Harrington's trembling hand. "It's over, Harrington," Holmes said, now within lunging distance. "Even if you were to escape us, Scotland Yard has your description. You've nowhere to go." I don't need to go anywhere," Harrington replied with sudden eerie calm. "The patterns are everywhere. Once I complete the final sequence, physical location will be immaterial." With shocking swiftness, he raised the monocle to his eye once more and produced something from his waistcoat pocket, a small brass tuning fork. Before any of us could react, he struck it against the wall and held it near the monocle. The effect was immediate and terrifying. The air in the laboratory seemed to thicken, pressure building in my ears, as if I had descended too rapidly in deep water. The remaining components of the resonance engine began to vibrate sympathetically, despite Lady Blackwood's partial disassembly of the device. Most disturbing was the change in Harrington himself. His body went rigid, his spine arching at an impossible angle, as the hand holding the monocle pressed it into his eye socket with increasing force. The keening sound returned, but this time it emanated from Harrington's throat, an inhuman wail that seemed to contain overtones beyond normal hearing. "Holmes!" I shouted over the noise. "What's happening to him?" My friend's face showed something I had rarely witnessed. Genuine alarm. "The resonance is building within him. The manuscript pages, Watson. Quickly!" Understanding his intent, I pulled the pages from my coat and thrust them toward him. Holmes rapidly sorted through them, searching for a specific diagram. "Lady Blackwood," he called out, "is there another tuning fork here? One calibrated to a higher frequency?" She nodded, pointing to a wooden case mounted on the wall. Holmes retrieved it, extracting a silver tuning fork larger than Harrington's brass one. "Cover your ears, both of you," he instructed. "This will be quite unpleasant." Holmes struck the silver fork against the stone floor and held it aloft. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen, but then I felt rather than heard a deep vibration passing through the room. The pressure in my ears intensified painfully. Harrington's reaction was immediate and violent. He screamed, a normal human scream of pain, and tore the monocle from his face. The brass device fell to the floor with a metallic clatter. One of its lenses cracked from the impact. "What have you done?" he gasped, staggering backward. "The patterns, they're breaking apart." "Counter-resonance," Holmes explained grimly. "Thornfield built fail-safes into his system, frequencies that would disrupt the effect if it grew too powerful. Lord Blackwood discovered this, which is why he hesitated to complete his work." The curator slumped against the wall, his face ashen. The manic energy that had sustained him seemed to drain away suddenly, leaving him looking older and desperately frail. Blood now flowed freely from his nose and ears, evidence of the physical toll the resonance had taken. "You've ruined everything," he whispered. "I've saved you from yourself," Holmes corrected, cautiously approaching to retrieve the damaged monocle. Though I fear the experience has left permanent effects. Harrington's gaze had become unfocused, his hands making small, repetitive gestures in the air, as if tracing invisible patterns. "I can still see them," he murmured. "Fainter now, but they're there. The vibrations that connect all things." The rain had begun to subside, its rhythm slowing from furious pounding to a gentler patter, With it, the oppressive atmosphere in the laboratory also diminished, the pressure easing from my ears. Lady Blackwood had finally succeeded in disassembling the critical components of the resonance engine, arranging them carefully on the workbench. "It can never be reassembled now," she said with evident relief. "Not without my husband's notes." "Which were never stolen," Holmes observed quietly. "You hid them yourself, didn't you?" She met his gaze steadily. "After Montgomery died, I knew someone would come for his research. I couldn't destroy it. It was his life's work. But I could ensure it remained separate from the manuscript." "A wise precaution," Holmes acknowledged. "And now?" Lady Blackwood looked at the broken monocle in Holmes's hand and the scattered manuscript pages. "Now, all of it must be destroyed. The knowledge is too dangerous." "I concur," Holmes said solemnly. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to build up the laboratory furnace. I believe a very hot fire is required." As I moved to comply, the sound of footsteps on the stone stairs announced new arrivals. Inspector Lestrade appeared at the laboratory entrance, flanked by 2 constables. "I received your message, Mr. Holmes," he announced, surveying the scene, with evident confusion. "Though I see you've already concluded matters without us, as usual." "Not entirely, Inspector," Holmes replied. "We have one conspirator in need of medical confinement." He gestured to Harrington, who continued to murmur to himself, lost in some private vision. "And a matter of public safety requiring your official supervision." Lestrade's eyebrows rose. "Public safety? Indeed." Holmes handed him the manuscript pages. "These documents and devices must be destroyed under police witness to ensure they can never again be used for harm." The inspector looked skeptical, but nodded. "If you say so, Holmes, and the explanation for Fairfield's death." Chapter 12. Echoes of Understanding. A week had passed since the events at Blackwood Manor. London had returned to its usual rhythms, the torrential rains giving way to the more customary autumn drizzle. Life at Baker Street had likewise settled into familiar patterns. Holmes engrossed in his chemical experiments, I in my medical journals, and Mrs. Hudson periodically appearing with tea and admonishments about the state of our rooms. On this particular evening, we sat before a cheerful fire, enjoying the simple pleasure of warmth and quiet companionship after our recent ordeal. The door to our sitting room opened to admit Inspector Lestrade, who had sent word earlier requesting a meeting. "Good evening, gentlemen," he greeted us, accepting the chair Holmes offered. "I've come to inform you that we've finally located Minton, the security guard," he added unnecessarily. "Dead, I presume?" Holmes inquired. Without looking up from the pipe he was carefully filling with tobacco. Lestrade blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Yes, found floating in the Thames yesterday morning. The coroner estimates he'd been in the water for several days. Harrington would have had no further use for him once their plan was exposed," Holmes remarked. "A loose end to be tidied away. You believe Harrington arranged his death? The man has been confined to Bedlam since the night we apprehended him," Lestrade protested. "Not personally, no. But Harrington wasn't working entirely alone, despite his claims to the contrary." Holmes struck a match and applied it to his pipe, drawing thoughtfully until the tobacco glowed. There were others involved peripherally, individuals who shared his obsession with Thornfield's work, but lacked his scholarly credentials. this Brotherhood of Resonance again?" I asked, recalling Harrington's words. A grandiose name for what was essentially a small circle of enthusiasts, Holmes confirmed, mostly harmless devotees of esoteric knowledge, with the exception of one or two who were willing to take more direct action. Lestrade frowned. "You have evidence of this conspiracy?" "Circumstantial, but compelling. The silver residue found in Blackwood's laboratory matched material found in a disused workshop near the docks, a workshop rented under a false name, but visited regularly by individuals connected to Harrington's academic circle." Holmes exhaled a perfect smoke ring. "I've provided Gregson with the relevant details. It's his division, after all." The inspector appeared slightly mollified at this acknowledgement of police protocol, though I detected a hint of disappointment that Holmes had entrusted the information to his rival at Scotland Yard. "And what of Mr. Harrington?" I inquired. "Has his condition improved?" Lestrade shook his head grimly. "The alienists say they've never seen anything quite like it. He spends his days drawing complex patterns and muttering about vibrations. Occasionally, he becomes agitated, claiming he can hear the resonance in the walls." He shuddered slightly. "I've seen many men broken by guilt or fear, but this is something else entirely. The human mind is not equipped to process reality in the way Thornfield's device attempted to reveal it," Holmes said quietly, "like trying to pour the ocean into a teacup." A comfortable silence fell as we contemplated this image. Eventually, Lestrade roused himself, producing a small notebook. "There's one matter I still don't fully understand, Holmes. For my official report," he added. "How exactly did Harrington cause the deaths of Lord Blackwood and Dr. Fairfield? You mentioned specific frequencies inducing fatal terror, but surely that's not scientifically possible." Holmes finished for him. "On the contrary, Inspector. Sound has profound physiological effects that science is only beginning to understand. Certain frequencies can induce seizures, others can alter heart rhythms. Still others can produce profound psychological states from euphoria to panic. Harrington discovered that the manuscript, when activated by the correct resonance patterns, could generate what might be called fear frequencies, vibrations that directly stimulate the brain's fear response to an unbearable degree." Holmes continued, "Both victims had weak hearts, making them particularly vulnerable. The terror induced cardiac arrest." "Ah, that was Thornfield's true genius," Holmes replied, warming to his subject. "He designed his cipher to activate only under specific atmospheric conditions. Water droplets of a certain size falling at a certain rate create micro-vibrations at a specific frequency. This serves as the initial catalyst for the resonance cascade. Hence the manuscript that screamed in the rain," I observed. "Precisely, Watson." Holmes nodded approvingly. Well, Thornfield created a system of knowledge that could only be accessed under specific conditions. An early form of environmental security, if you will. Lestrade looked dubious, but made notes nonetheless. "And Lady Blackwood, what becomes of her?" "She leaves for the continent tomorrow," Holmes replied. "Her husband's affairs are settled, and she wishes to distance herself from the tragedy. A wise decision given the circumstances." "She knew more than she initially revealed," I pointed out. "Indeed, she suspected Harrington's involvement in her husband's death, but lacked proof." By donating the manuscript to the library, she hoped to separate it from the resonance engine, rendering both harmless. Holmes tapped his pipe thoughtfully. She underestimated Harrington's determination and his willingness to kill. The manuscript itself is destroyed completely, Lestrade asked. Every page, Holmes confirmed. Along with Blackwood's notes and the components of the eye. The knowledge is lost as it should be. Seems a waste, Lestrade remarked, if this acoustic science could be properly studied. Some doors, Inspector, are best left closed, Holmes interrupted firmly. There are fields of human inquiry where the dangers far outweigh potential benefits. This is one of them. The three of us fell silent, watching the fire cast dancing shadows across the familiar walls of our Baker Street lodgings. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, ordinary harmless rain that carried no unearthly screams. After Lestrade's departure, I found myself reflecting on the peculiar nature of the case. It's not often we encounter a mystery with elements so close to the supernatural, Holmes. And yet the explanation was entirely scientific, he replied, if at the boundaries of current understanding. Ambrose Thornfield was merely centuries ahead of his time, exploring principles of acoustics and resonance that modern science has yet to fully comprehend. Do you think we've seen the last of Thornfield's work? I asked. Surely there must be other manuscripts, other discoveries. Undoubtedly. Knowledge is rarely confined to a single source. Holmes stared contemplatively into the fire. But, without the proper instruments and the specific environmental conditions, such manuscripts remain merely curiosities, like opera scores without musicians or instruments. He rose and crossed to the window, watching the raindrops trace patterns down the glass. What fascinates me, Watson, is not the acoustic principles themselves, but rather what they suggest about the nature of reality. That sound, mere vibrations in the air, could alter perception so profoundly hints at how tenuous our grasp on reality truly is. A philosophical turn, Holmes, I remarked with surprise. That's unlike you. He smiled faintly. Even I occasionally ponder the greater mysteries, my friend, though I prefer those that can be solved through observation and deduction rather than metaphysical speculation. As if to punctuate his return to practicality, Holmes turned from the window and retrieved his violin case from beside the bookshelf. Speaking of acoustics, I've been working on a new composition. Would you care to hear it? Gladly, I replied, settling deeper into my chair. As the first notes filled our rooms, I reflected that while we had silenced the puzzle that screamed in the rain, some mysteries, like the unfathomable brilliance of my friend Sherlock Holmes, remained, delightfully unsolved, and in truth I preferred it that way.